Good morning. My name is Bruce Peret, and I'll be presenting an introduction to the concepts behind the reciprocal system of theory. My focus here is on the reciprocal relation between space and time, and how it defines a more complete view of the universe in which we live. For some background, the reciprocal system of theory was created by Dewey Larson, a chemical engineer, back in the 1950s. Encouraged by exchanges with his friend, classmate, and fraternity brother, Linus Pauling, Larson documented his initial thoughts on the universe based on a concept of motion, the reciprocal relationship between space and time, in his first book, The Structure of the Physical Universe. He self-published it through North Pacific Publishers, a company owned by himself and his wife, Dorothy. They sent out hundreds of free copies to universities and researchers across the globe. Now, despite all the claims of scientists looking for a theory of everything, when confronted with one that did not fit their existing paradigm, well, scientists did what they often do: get out their crosses, wooden stakes, silver bullets, and light the funeral pyres. Larson's theories were met with outright rejection, but that didn't stop him. Larson continued his research through the late 1970s, eventually deciding to stop his research and document what he had discovered in an expanded edition of his first work, now published in 4 volumes. The first volume, Nothing But Motion, describes general theory, basic atomic physics, and general chemistry. Basic Properties of Matter, which is a collection of papers documenting how material properties could be derived directly from the structure of the atom, without having to take measurements in curve-fit solutions. In it, he addresses concepts like interatomic distance, heat and thermal motion, basic electrical relations, magnetism, electrostatics, isotopes, and radioactivity. The Universe of Motion is Larson's venture into astronomy and cosmology, demonstrating the general applicability of the reciprocal system to different scales. What he discovered was that the evolutionary processes of conventional astronomy were backwards, because of an error in understanding in the stellar combustion process, which he documents as age-limit fission, not fusion. Having a good idea of the natural consequences involved in creating a physical universe, Larson noticed that there were things that just didn't fit in, things like life, ethics, and paranormal ability. His final volume, Beyond Space and Time, is a venture into those areas, using the same concepts he developed for the physical structure, but taking it outside the physical realm of time and space. Larson wrote a number of other books during his research years, documenting and summarizing some specific cases: New Light on Space and Time, a general theory of atomic structure; Beyond Newton, focusing on what gravity is and what it isn't; The Neglected Facts of Science, good starter book that addresses some of the common problems with science and how easily a reciprocal relation resolves them; The Case Against the Nuclear Atom focuses on the problems with the nuclear structure and a far easier way to express it as rotational systems. Larson was the first to admit that his system was far from complete, and it would be up to others to continue development of his initial concepts. The first among these was a young professor from a university in India, one KVK Nehru, who had extended dialogues with Larson, proposing alternate, and often better, interpretations of concepts Larson had put forth. There were many controversies over the simplistic nature of Larson's photon model, and Nehru had found a unique solution that solved many of the behavioral problems with Larson's model, that of the concept of birotation. Rather than light being a vibration, it was a combination of opposite rotations, shearing to form a vibration. This concept explained things such as the Zeeman effect, Stark splitting, and polarization. I have found that, as a general rule these days, people do not like to change, because if they change, they might actually grow. As usual, Nehru's concepts involved a fundamental change at the root of Larson's reciprocal system, the photon, so they were not well received. The basic premise of the reciprocal system is that we live in a physical universe that can be completely defined by just 2 concepts, space and time, existing in a reciprocal relationship to each other. This ratio is what Larson calls motion. The relation of space to time, such as miles per hour, is our everyday concept of speed. The inverse of speed, time to space, is what we refer to as the mechanical concept of work. It took me 3 hours to push that car a quarter mile. Time related to distance is energy. One of the big complaints people have about Larson's concept of motion is, how can you have motion without anything moving? Well, that's just a misunderstanding based on a poor choice of words by Larson. Motion is just a generic name you picked for the ratio of space to time, any ratio of space to time. So you can think of it this way: you can have a ratio without any rationing. A direct consequence of using ratios, the multiplicative inverse, is that your origin of measurement is unity, not zero, as used by conventional science. It also infers that the minimum quantity you can have of anything is 1, which is an agreement with nature. In nature, you cannot have none of something. This unit origin of measurement is referred to as the natural datum of the reciprocal system. In the reciprocal system, essentially, all is 1. Because unity is the default condition, for something to exist it must be offset from that unity. Larson calls these offsets a displacement, and all structure is created by displacement from unity. Interesting philosophical considerations here. So what exactly is unity? Well, it's the one thing that is common to every reference frame, the speed of light. When the speed of light is taken in natural units, rather than the conventional units defined by man for distance and time, it has a value of 1 unit of space per 1 unit of time. Very simple. In Larson's 1959 book, The Structure of the Physical Universe, he discusses the concept of natural units as a consequence of having only 2 units to deal with, space and time. All the conventional units of measure, feet, meters, seconds, grams, pounds, Newton, pascals, you name it, there's about 240 of them, can be expressed as a simple power relation of space to time or time to space. In the reciprocal system, we don't have need to assign a name to every possible combination of space and time, or assign multiple names to the same relationship as conventional science does. For example, we have these basic concepts: distance or length, space; duration or time, time, t; velocity or speed, the relation of space to time; energy, the joule, the relationship of time to space, your basic quantity of work; acceleration, space divided by time squared; force, the Newton, time divided by space squared, the conjugate, not the inverse; momentum, the Newton second, is the relation of time squared divided by space squared; mass, in grams, kilograms, or pounds, is time cubed divided by space cubed; pressure in pascals, atmospheres, psi, and other measurements of pressure, are T over S to the fourth. All are just a ratio of space to time with different exponents. Natural units are of general applicability, which means that mechanical, electrical, and any other system of measure can be expressed as a ratio of space to time. As such, similar concepts can be identified by similar ratios. For an electric example, power in watts is 1 over S. The dipole moment, and many of the folks who are going, what the heck is that, is nothing more than an amount of time. Electric current, the ampere, is simply S over T, a speed. The electric charge, in joules, is T over S, the same as work or energy. Resistance, not so futile, is the ohm, with the odd-looking units of T squared over S cubed, until we realize that resistance is nothing more than mass, T cubed over S cubed, per unit of time. If it didn't take time to push something, we would have no resistance. Pole strength in Webers is simply the magnetic version of momentum. Inductance has the same units of mass, T cubed over S cubed. Capacitance, T cubed over T, is just a volume per unit of time, a rate of flow like gallons per minute. The use of natural units in equations helps to develop consistent equations. If the space and time aspects don't add up, then there's something wrong. The basic equation of motion is velocity, S over t. Acceleration is velocity divided by time, S over t squared. Force is defined by mass times acceleration, having energetic units of T over S squared, the same as energy per unit distance. On the electrical side, voltage is the product of current as a speed, and resistance, mass per unit of time. Energy, E equals mc squared, parallels the electrical version of E equals to I squared RT, where current, like the speed of light, is a speed, and RT is conceptually the same as mass. By using natural units, these conceptual relations become obvious rather than hidden. Natural units both validate and simplify physical quantities. Take, for example, the concept of pressure. Pressure is measured in pascals, with the units of T over S to the fourth. In a 3D universe, we normally don't encounter fourth power expressions, so this is a composite of 2 things going on. In this case, there are 2 examples. First is that of the pressure cooker, where the energy of steam, T over S, is being contained in a volume, 1 over S cubed. Second is that of atmospheric pressure, which is the force, T over S squared, being exerted on an area of the ground, 1 over S squared. The natural units explain what is going on conceptually. And again, this is of general applicability. The Wikipedia lists the units for the permittivity of free space thusly: Coulomb squared per Newton per square meter, or amps squared times seconds to the fourth power times the inverse of mass per cubic meter, or in the simplistic form, farads per meter. In the reciprocal system, it's just area per unit time. Which would you rather memorize for a test? By the same token, natural units are quite useful to validate concepts and equations. If they don't add up, something is wrong. Consider the capacitor, an electrical device to store charge. Charges work, as previously shown, with the natural units of energy, T over S. Let's look at some of the equations. Work done by voltage, looks good. Voltage-current relationship, also good. Energy of charge, nope. That does not add up to T over S, it adds up to S. The product of capacitance in farads and voltage of force is not energy but space. This equation is conceptually wrong, and is one that Larson identified in his book Basic Properties of Matter, having to make a distinction between the energy of charge, T over S, and what he termed the quantity of charge, which this is representing as S. When the equations don't add up, just invent a universal constant with the terms to make it add up. Universal constants aren't at all constant. Just an admission of something goes here, but we don't know what. We've been discussing the relation between space and time. So what are these things and how are they different? Simple answer is they're just two aspects of a ratio, nothing more, like the numerator and denominator, or the heads and tails of a coin. It's just a convention that we've picked to represent a dichotomy. In ancient philosophy, space is considered yang and time is yin, the time-space being the Tao of motion. Since space and time are just aspects, they must behave the same way. Everything that exists in space must therefore exist in time. Everything that exists in time must also exist in space. Space has 3 dimensions, therefore time has 3 dimensions. Time has a clock, therefore space has a clock. Interesting concept, isn't it? The reciprocal of our conventional frame of reference is 3D time with clock space, a concept unique to the reciprocal system, which has been promoted by researchers such as David Wilcock of History Channel fame. Space and time define the ratio of motion. We observe 2 kinds of stable, non-accelerated motion. For example, if we hop in our spacesuits and go out into deep space with a baseball, there are 2 things we can do to generate motion of that baseball. First is to throw it, where it moves away from us in a straight line. That's a linear velocity. Second, we can spin it, where it stays in the same spot, rotating on the axis of spin forever. This is an angular velocity. Both of these velocities require a single scalar magnitude to express that speed, so they are one-dimensional velocities, and angular in revolutions per second. All other motions are a combination of these 2 primary motions. This is what Professor Nehru was getting at in his paper on the conservation of direction, proposing birotation, 2 counter-spinning rotations that produce the vibration of the photon. It makes a lot of sense, for when a photon, such as a gamma ray, is destroyed, it splits into 2 particles, an electron and a positron. The electron is a rotating unit of space, and the positron is a rotating unit of time, 2 counter-rotations. This brings us to the Yin-Yang of motion, how linear and angular motion combine to produce all the structure we know. Note that this is an RS2 concept. Larson realized that there had to be a rotational component, but was a strictly linear yang-type thinker, so he had to invent a rotational base to account for the yin aspect of the universe. In RS2, we give equal priority to yin and yang, the feminine and masculine aspects of structure. What we observe of these primary motions is that the yang linear velocity is expressed as a series of connected locations that define a 3-dimensional structure. It is basically connected dot in 3D, much like the structure of a Rubik's Cube. A problem then arises in that we can only observe the structures created with connected dot. So when a yin angular velocity is present, We don't know how to interpret it because it is sitting at the same location all the time, spinning around. So we came up with a concept to describe it, what Larson refers to as equivalent space, and conventional science calls force fields. Unlike linear structure, these fields cannot be directly observed. They can only be detected by how they change the connected dot relationships, how yin changes yang, or how time changes space. Let's take a minute to summarize what we already know. Space is linear, and by itself we observe space as empty. It's a vacuum. But space has stuff in it. That stuff is tangible. We can touch it. Therefore, it cannot be a vacuum. Since space is a vacuum, that stuff cannot be space. The only other choice we have for stuff, since we only have two choices, is time. So, what is this stuff we call time? As mentioned earlier, time has three dimensions. The stuff of time is a 3D temporal structure existing at a location in 3D space. We call this stuff particles, atoms, and molecules. Yep, that stuff all around us is actually time, not space. The empty regions between are the space. Enter again that nasty reciprocal relation. If we live in a region where space is empty and time is full, then the reciprocal should exist, a region where time is empty and space is full. These two conditions, where the stuff of time is in empty space and the stuff of space is in empty time, form the Yin-Yang of motion, what Larson refers to as the two sectors that comprise the physical universe. The material sector has matter comprised of a 3D temporal rotation, yin, linked to a 3D spatial location, yang. Like the Taiji 2, this yin-yang combination is inseparable. If you've got space, you've got time. If you've got time, you have space. Now the cosmic sector, its inverse, becomes the realm of antimatter. Because the reciprocal system is based on the multiplicative inverse, antimatter is technically inverse matter, being a 3D spatial rotation, the yin aspect of space, linked to a 3D temporal location, the yang aspect of time. It is not based on charge, but on displacements from unity, as discussed earlier about the natural datum being unity. One half of the universe, the material sector, is moving at a fraction of the speed of light, 1 over n, where n is the temporal displacement. That's the half we observe, measure, and spend our lives in, the conventional reference frame, as Larson calls it. The other half of the universe, the cosmic sector, is moving at speeds faster than light, n over 1, where n is a spatial displacement. In the old days, study of the cosmic half of the universe where space appears as a solid with bubbles of time in it was called the ether. Larson derived ether as a natural consequence of the reciprocal system, being the inverse realm of 3D time and clock space, referred to the New Age as the metaphysical realm. When researching the various ether concepts that were popular in the 19th century, I found the term became a catch-all for a number of concepts that are clearly distinguished in the reciprocal system. First is the progression of the natural reference system, which is the unit speed motion that is moving outward, wanting to push everything apart at the speed of light. Astronomers refer to this as the Hubble expansion, a name for the scalar expansion of the universe. Problem rose, however, because conventional astronomy has a datum of 0, not unit speed, the speed of light. So they had to invent something to account for this tendency to fly apart at the speed of light, and they called it dark energy. It's dark because it cannot be observed. Why? Because it doesn't actually exist. The problem only arises because they do not recognize the natural, unit speed datum that is the basis of the reciprocal relation between space and time. Next is the rotational nature of equivalent space. We can only observe this yin angular velocity as a field effect. Ether spins with its cycloid spiral motion and vortices. Now we have the inversion created by equivalent time. Just as space has its equivalent space, the inversion of space, the cosmic half of the universe has its time and equivalent time, the inversion of time. Equivalent time appears as an invisible solid, the stuff ether is made of, in the region between antiatoms. In the material sector, we are builders, masons. We start with something, then add stuff to it until we have something. From our perspective, any structure in time appears inside out from this, like a stonemason sculpting a statue. They grab a chunk of solid rock, then chip away everything that doesn't look like the object they're trying to create. Ether works the same way. You start with a solid, then create bubbles, like the theosophical koilon, of different dimensional structures to create temporal objects. What it comes down to is that conventional physics only addresses roughly 1/4 of the universe, the observable, linear, yang portion of space. The rest are avoided because it is there you will find the soul of the universe and the key to all these free energy systems you hear so much about, but nobody knows how they work. To summarize, from our perspective there exist two sectors of the universe. A material one, based on space-time relations, that is constructive, builds up from nothing to something, and is based off of clock time. The other is the cosmic one, when viewed from our conventional perspective, is energy based in time-space as a destructive sculpting system. Note that I say our perspective, because if you were actually born in the cosmic sector, everything would be flipped around, and our material sector would be the ether, and we look like the solid with the bubbles, and they would have the vacuum with the stuff of themselves in it. Larson's conceptual model resulted in two postulates that define his reciprocal system of physical theory. First, the physical universe is composed of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. Second, the physical universe conforms to the relations of ordinary, commutative mathematics, its primary magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. With this starting point, Larson was able to deduce the observable physical universe as a natural consequence of his theory. It was very close, but not perfect. The RS2 re-evaluation fixed a number of these problems with Larson's first draft of a theory of everything, and modified the second postulate ever so slightly, as concepts like projective geometry were not well known back in the 1950s outside of military applications. The RS2 version of the second postulate is: the physical universe conforms to the relations of ordinary mathematics, its primary magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is projective. Note that we just modified 2 things. Commutative was removed, as rotational systems do not commute. I times j is not equal to James times I in imaginary numbers, and the yin aspects of motion are included in RS2. We can rotate without anything to rotate. Geometry was changed to projective from Euclidean, as motion is basically an invariant cross ratio of projective geometry. Larson actually uses projective geometry in all his scalar relations, as scalar motion is distinctly non-Euclidean in that it has no geometry at all. As they say, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. So let's call the geometry that Larson uses by its real name, projective. The reciprocal system has some fundamental differences from conventional thought. If you try to use conventional understanding to understand a universe based on motion, you're going to fail. So let's look at some of the differences. The speed of light, the velocity of the progression of the natural reference system, is basically the end of the tape from which everything is measured. The speed of light is absolute in the sense that it is the natural datum of measurement. If the end of your tape measure is a random number every time you use it, you'll never get the size of anything. Faster than light speeds are commonplace, forming the cosmic half of the universe. N over 1 is just as probable as 1 over n, our conventional experience. Using natural units, universal constants disappear, or become very simple like 2 pi. Most of these constants occur because a piece of the puzzle is still missing. Once you account for all the pieces, there's no need for them. All magnitudes in the reciprocal system are finite, which Larson calls absolute magnitudes. As such, there are no divide by zero errors or infinities to contend with. If you do encounter one, then you've switched aspects or sectors and, for example, are trying to apply temporal motion using spatial equations. As Scotty from Star Trek would say, the right tool for the right job. You have to make sure you're using temporal coordinates in a temporal system and spatial coordinates in a spatial system and not get them confused. All the devices constructed by conventional science become unnecessary. The reciprocal relation between space and time provides a framework to understand what is actually going on without ad hoc invention. The primary features of the reciprocal system are that it greatly simplifies chemical and molecular properties, particularly bonding, as there aren't any bonds in the reciprocal system. It's all a matter of orientation to cancel net motion. It's just like twisting a puzzle piece until it snaps into place. It also simplifies astronomy and cosmology, because astronomers have it backwards. The only thing needed to create stars and galaxies is gravity, when you flip the direction around. With natural units, it is easy to eliminate bogus or incorrect formulas and equations, because they just don't add up. Natural consequences of the reciprocal relation assist in viable conceptual models. This kind of checksum has been missing from physical theory for quite some time. I have primarily focused on the physical aspects of the reciprocal system, but it does not stop there. Larson realized that he was able to define the physical universe as a natural consequence of his theory, but the observed universe contained more than those consequences provided for. By removing the physical from the observed, Larson was left over with a bunch of things he could not really identify but gave it a shot in his last book, Beyond Space and Time. Continuing those natural consequences, Larson found that life is a natural consequence of physics, and just another stage of the complexification of motion. Ethics then becomes a natural consequence of evolving life. Metaphysics, psionic ability, and most paranormal phenomena are all a natural consequence of the material-cosmic relation. Faster than light travel on the 3D space side is slower than light travel on the 3D time side. This is where the concept of folding space and wormholes comes in. Extrasensory abilities in space are just normal, intuitive abilities in time. Simple explanations on how alternative energy devices function. They aren't free, but are over unity because they are operating on the cosmic side of motion. Faster than light, and the speed of light is unity, therefore over unity. Makes sense now, doesn't it? The reciprocal relation can make an educated guess as to what's out there by extrapolating fundamental principles as natural consequences of the theory. But one must remain open to those consequences, as most of what we know is backwards. If you are interested in taking a look at what the reciprocal system has to offer in terms of life, the universe, and everything, we have some resources available. The main site is reciprocalsystem.org, run by the International Society of Unified Science, a non-profit organization. If you are interested in the more metaphysical side of things, including personal development and investigation into the paranormal using principles of the reciprocal system, you may find the Antiquitas Forum interesting. The RS2 investigation began on this site and was later moved as a separate line of research. If you are into the new age, the raw material, and seeing what the reciprocal system has to offer at the extreme end of the speculation spectrum, check out the Daniel papers on conscious hugs. They started with an RS analysis of geoengineering and proceeded to time travel, warp speed, a detailed analysis of global control mechanisms, and a revisiting of the colonization of Earth by the gods. If you enjoy going boldly where no man has gone before, you will want to check out the Daniel papers, but definitely not for the closed-minded. Dewey Larson's books are available on the website and on Amazon. If you have questions, please feel free to post them on the RS2 Research Forum, and the folks there will do the best to help you out. Thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation.